Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and meta-modernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
All right, welcome to the next part of the dialogue, where we're talking about spirituality and modernity.
Thank you for joining us once again. And I would say let's jump back in. I think one of the questions that we were kind of tackling with was the question of modernity and meta-modernism and how they differ a bit when we do engage in spirituality, when we do engage in any form of like critical thinking. And I thought that would be a good way to work this discussion out and maybe talk a little bit about modernity and why meta-modernism is savory, if you will. Just as a quick note, meta-modernism is the culmination of not only the modern movement, modernity, but also the postmodern movement. So there's these two flows that have been kind of fighting with each other for some time, and meta-modernity tries to work on reconciling both of them. So I guess it would be smart to talk about modernity and what it espouses, at least a little bit, and what the heck does it have to do with race, right?
Good one.
It's especially at this day where race is such a critical issue, and we just kind of have to talk about it and engage those places. So I'll kind of segue it into you, Aaron. What are your thoughts, at least, on what is modernity? Why does it leave sometimes a bad taste in in your spiritual or critical thinking mouth, if you will?
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, when thinking about modernity, thinking of authors and writers such as W.E.B. Du Bois, especially when he brings up this concept of double consciousness in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. So it's interesting because in this book, he's exploring the psychological and social effects of racism, and he's introducing this concept of double consciousness. And it's interesting because we see this a lot throughout history when colonialism or this theopoetic symbol of the colonizer is integrating or meeting difference or different people, usually people of color, and then trying to erase their identities, their history, even their theology. So that's where it gets really complicated, where our spirituality is affected by these things too. It's not just our race, our skin complexion, or just our class, in terms of economics, but it's also that aspect of ourselves that cannot be measured or seen with the human eye. And we refer to, in terms of spirituality. These things are being affected by these things outward, and so double consciousness comes up for me when thinking about spirituality and modernity, as well as another thinker, writer, author, and pretty much an early theopoet, Ruben Alves, when he's talking about spiritual alienation. Like this, how does something or a group of people or a system make you feel not part of, even spiritually, like, and so for me, someone who explores and studies and is in a process of healing religious trauma, spiritual alienation hits home for me really close, because this concept of making someone feel so alienated that they don't even feel comfortable in their own body, in their own flesh, it really pushes us to never feel like we're part of anything. And that's a lot of stress, you know. What are your thoughts?
As you're talking, I'm reminded of you're hitting on a feeling, right? It's not even a feeling, because it's this experience that's being realized of what happens when empire tries to oppress knowledge of the people they are oppressing, right? And oppressing their identity and their authentic way of being, right? So when you're looking at how a group can come in and wipe out your major army and says we're taking over the government, and they can wipe out a number of people and say the rest of you are now part of us. And in order to survive, guess what? Yeah, I am that. And they're held with this form of double consciousness. I have to be them in order to survive, but I'm still who I am. And I fight to reconcile both of them. We see this historically throughout, right? If we look at Roman Greco culture, when Rome was taking over and forming their world, people didn't have history. Rome was history. Everything else was, you have no history until you become a part of us. And you can do what you want, but hey, we are Rome. The Pax Romana, right? The peace of Rome. That goes into that framework. I mean, when you're looking at Roman Catholicism and their colonizing moments, right? Whether it's in the one I'm familiar with, I'm thinking about the moment is in Latin America, how the churches would come in and reframe the values of what's important, so that when the empire comes in, the colonizers come in, there is no longer this formal identity of who they were, but now they're hidden inside within themselves. They're syncretizing, right? Their God and our gods, their saints with our gods, to try to salvage and keep what they have, but at the same time, meeting the needs of survival. Let me do what the colonizer needs. So when you're talking about this notion of double consciousness, yes, that's what you're seeing in modernity, when it boils down to this notion of empire, right? And empire coming in and trying to assert their framework of thinking. And that framework of thinking is Roman Greek logic, or the empire's logic, right? The empire's reason, and the empire's sort of empirical evidence. So if we wanted to kind of highlight what a modernity is, modernity tried to be universal in its approach, but it still comes from empire, right? It still comes from empire. So that form of logic and reasoning, we praise Descartes, and we're grateful for Descartes for his work. But let's be honest, he's not doing this as a free man in Africa, or he's not doing this as a free Latino, in not Latin America, wherever he's at, whether it's the Aztec in space or anything like that. Those knowledges have been wiped out or marginalized, and we're only beginning to probably get some of the inklings of it. Modernity, as it came in, is sort of like this universalizing presence, that there is this one framework of logic, there is this one framework of reasoning and thinking, and as well as evidence, right? Empirical evidence. that is primary, and that should be our way of thinking. And that's problematic, right? When you're looking at other nations and other knowledges and their formation. And so I think with that, you have some of those issues and problems that came in with modernity. Let's once again be grateful. I mean, the fact that we're here today talking and we're reasoning is because of that modernity. But we're kind of using it in a sort of decolonizing way, right? We're kind of saying, hey, you've done wrong by it as well. So I think in holding on to that double consciousness, we've been fighting with how the colonizers have been using reasoning and science, which is great, but using these tools to kind of usurp other nations and what they've thought. And in order for them to survive, they have to take it on. They have to take on those roles. It's led to a great evolution in our framework of thinking, but it's also killed off or turned the other knowledges as lesser than. They probably call it indigenous. They'll probably put it in the space of folk thinking, folk theology, and therefore no longer adequate for our time, no longer adequate for our place and space. And I think that's where we're running up against with some of the critiques of modernity, because it does not allow for other knowledges to take place. And I'll pause here, and I just want to make this one case. This is why Charles Foucault is essential. He critiques that type of discourse, right? That's a power discourse that's in play here. And this power discourse is, here you are, you claim to have a universal knowledge, but under it are these marginal knowledges that are breaking or making cracks, because universal knowledge cannot answer to certain things, and therefore these marginal knowledges kind of peak out at that moment, saying, hey, here I am, I have a response to that. Here's a reason why. You don't know this event. You don't know this history. And Foucault, that's why he wants to say we need to do these genealogies. And he calls his work an archaeology, right? You have to dig deep, break through these universal knowledges, quote unquote, and reach through and look at these other knowledges that are calling out in that way. So I would at least first want to say that modernity's reasoning and logic may have won the day, but it also has hurt us, because we've lost a lot of who we are, the colonized, in that. And that's where meta-modernism comes in as not as a saving grace, but at least of an acknowledgement of that, and a way of reparations, repairing. How do we begin including these marginalized knowledges, not even calling it marginalized, but saying that it's adequate, that it speaks to us, and therefore re-enchants, right? Re-enchants the sciences, re-enchants our knowledge to make it useful and powerful for today. Kind of want to pause on that.
Yeah, definitely. You brought up amazing points that recalled to my mind this kind of theopoetic analogy of me as a child and asking my mother, why does this work the way it works? And my mother representing this modernist response. It is because I say it is, and that's it, And so we have like this universal response to things that we just say, we figured it out and this is how it is. And there's no room for critical thinking, because if you start asking these questions, you get this pushback of shut up, do as I say, and stop asking these questions. I already told you the answer, that theopoetically represents this modernist spirit of we figured it out, we know, you know. And in terms of how this affects us spiritually, just think about it. You know, there's so many aspects of ourselves that we're unaware of. You know, Carl Jung speaks of the unconscious parts of our mind and believed that God resides in that aspect of ourselves, you know, this part of ourselves that we cannot control, tame, we can only really just experience and try to make sense of for ourselves. And it's so interesting that modernist thinking takes on this role by saying, oh, yeah, we know who God is. We know everything about God. You know, so like theologically, you can start to see there's some sort of pressure that's building to create like this trauma later on when believers and followers say, well, how do we know this is exactly what God is? Then that usually becomes like a question that, you know, gets confronted with your faith is lacking. And then it distracts the critical thinker to say, oh, I shouldn't question God then. I shouldn't question whether this version or understanding of God is inaccurate, because that makes me wrong. That makes me faulty. That makes my faith weak. And if my faith is weak, that means I need to stop questioning God. You know, so like it gets really confusing for anybody that's trying to figure things out for themselves. But like you said, love what you said. Without modernity, we wouldn't be where we are. So we're deeply grateful for that. But it is dangerous and concerning that there's certain aspects that weren't considered. And that's why we love meta-modernism and this approach to go back, kind of like our cousins in Africa and their way of thinking in terms of Sankofa, right? To go back and retrieve so that we can go forward. And we really feel like spiritually, meta-modernism allows us to do this principle, this act, you know, and experience some form of, like you said, repairing and reparations. You know, this could be a part of that, you know, where we go back and we start asking these questions of, well, as this was going on, simultaneously these other things were going on, you know, and we should think about that, because the information given to us is biased. It's only considering one perspective, one grand universal perspective that, like you said, is carved out by the conqueror, who is the colonizer, the emperor, you know, and the emperor says what happened and how it went down, you know. So I think that's where it gets really interesting, because our good friend Ruben Alves pushes us to question these systems, these oppressive systems, you know, and makes claim that they're harmful to us in the sense that it prevents us, or prevents the ability for us to dream, hope, and even imagine alternative realities, because we're only focused on the colonizer or the conqueror's realities, symbols, language, and even dreams, which those dreams could look like keeping us enslaved, you know?
Hey there, listeners. Dr. Waldron here. If you're enjoying the deep dives in today's conversation, we've got something that might interest you. Throughout this podcast, we mention a variety of books that align with various themes, concepts, ideas, as well as theopoetic, symbolism. Whether we're talking about meta-modernism, psychology, spirituality, film, or even philosophy, by using the Amazon affiliate links we've provided in the episode description, not only can you get your hands on these books quickly and easily, but you'll also be supporting this podcast project at no extra cost to you. It's simple. It's a really simple way to show your support and help us continue bringing thoughtful, enriching content your way. So the next time you're curious about a book we discuss, click the link in the show notes or in the description. And thank you for helping us keep this journey going. With that said, let's get back to the dialogue.
What do you think about that?
I'm just writing down certain things that you're saying because some thoughts are coming to mind. So if you see me pointing down, it's because of that on my little journal.
That's good.
As you're talking, something else is popping up, and once again, it goes back to modernity, and what meta-modernists approach is trying to get at. I think we also have to give credit to modernity and what it's doing, both modernity and post-modernity. So because of the reasoning, and these logics that are formed out of modernity, that's one great thing. But what it also allowed for is sort of like this pluralism of thought. And it does allow for this diversity that takes place. But what's really interesting is that although it allows for diversity, it's still trying to deal with universal principles. So how do you? So it creates this paradox in modernity, right? Why? So I think if you wanted to say, well, why is there diversity? Well, people can come around science. People can come around logic, right? Logic becomes a universal principle. We can use that. You know, logic at least has its inklings and beginnings in Roman Greco thought, right? But finds its force in Islamic traditions. And so then you could have these conversations that are coming into place, right? Plato is within that Plato writes within Greek and Rome, but there's some great Platonists in Islamic thought. You have Aristotle, but guess what? Some of the best thinkers in Aristotle are from Islam. Averroes, Ibn Arabi, Sukhwardi, all of these phenomenal thinkers. So at least in terms of the exchange of thinking, there is this beauty that arises, right? That comes from this philosophical framework of thinking, and they can apply it to their religious settings. So at least reason and logic and the sciences are unifiers. And there's a beauty to that. So thankful for that beauty. And yet, because there's this pluralism, there is tension. Why am I bringing that up? Because you have, when we're talking about this term of double consciousness, and we're talking about, there's something else that you haven't mentioned yet now on spiritual alienation, which I would love for us to continue on in. But going back to this part on modernity and pluralism, they accept pluralism because of the unifying nature of logic and philosophy and science. But there's tension because now we're starting to say, well, who has the right understanding of Aristotle? Who has the correct understanding? Because if it's in that religious space, in that framework, guess what? Now, then who has the right understanding and interpretation of the divine? Those are some underlying aspects that are there. Like for instance, you have Averroes, who was a Islamic philosopher, scholar, who was a great Aristotelian, if I'm not mistaken, and spoke on the soul. And you have Thomas Aquinas that pushes back because he saw a lot of Averroesian Catholic priests, and he had to critique and affirm his Catholic faith. And he's a great orator. He's a great writer, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, he's a lawyer in the way, in his writing and form, right? If you look at his Summa Theologica, a brilliant writer, and he's able to defend his work. But it leaves that tension. There's a pluralism, wonderful, but the tension continues on, and that tension begins to show and break because modernity is saying there's a tension within pluralism. There's this, we can tolerate it, but there's going to be a point that we can't tolerate it anymore. I think we start to see that. That becomes even more clear in American history when we're looking at the Protestant church and the socialist and fundamentalist movements. I know I'm throwing a lot of pieces here, and we probably have to break that down, but it speaks to modernity and the question arises of who the heck is correct. Because if we believe that there's universal principles, and those universal principles lead us to the divine, well, then who has correct interpretation of the scripture? Who has correct interpretation of how we are called to think? Because that's what Christianity does, and that's a lot of religious systems are these, they bring it all together. And it leads to what I consider today is the main problem. Who's going to win? Who's going to be the one-all be-all of it? And so there's always this back and forth tension between Christianity and socialist movements, which is moving away from maybe a modernist agenda, or maybe an offshoot of that, to the more fundamentalist groups that are saying, no, there's this universal principle. It's got to be this way. We have to prove it. And we'll use force if necessary, because toleration no longer works. Theopoetics counters that. This is where you come in. This is what's so beautiful. Theopoetics actually says that theology isn't it, right? Theology as this universalizing doctrine, these doctrines that are universal in scope, because it doesn't allow for that novelty or that creativity. That, if we just follow these principles, that's it. We're done and we're good, and we'll continue to survive. Guess what? We do that with science, right? And we just build on it. What happens if there's something's new? It wipes everything under it, right? We always hear in science, hey, there's a rewriting because we found this new thing. These books are no longer valid. They don't want to say that about scripture. We don't want to say that about our spirituality. So guess what? We have to hunker down on these fundamentalist thoughts and say, okay, someone's wrong and it's not us, because then it would hold religion susceptible to the same rules as science, that everything before is invalid. I think the modernist approach tries to really trying to hold on to it and reinvigorate the fundamentalist principles, while certain groups try to move away from it. And that leads to that tension that's there. And that leads to people with double conscience, who maybe have grown up within religious frameworks and get trauma and find no relief in theology, but find hope in theopoetics, right? Because it's that place where they can imagine and hope and see the divine in their current state, right? You did a poem about I think it was your mother's cooking. What was it? What was your mother cooking that you? It was a theopoetic engagement of it. What was it?
Smell.
It was a smell. And what was she cooking?
She was actually cooking rice and gandules, but it was throwing down. But yeah, the whole point was just the food that was being made just brought us back, to these other thoughts and ideas. It wasn't just about eating, which could be like the survival mode, but it was beyond that. We were in a place in our mind and our spirit that was taken back, like time didn't exist, sort of, like this sacred liminal space within our own memories and our mind of these senses were just vibrant, like the smells and the sounds and and just hanging out and being there with my grandmother or my mother. These are memories that was just like, wow, like they're gone now, but that's all we have is those memories. and it feels so divine, you know. And it all started with just a smell of cooking, you know.
And what's beautiful about that, and I would tell you, if this was thinking within a modernist framework, they'd probably throw you out, is that to do we what is divine, right? And when you're talking about your mother's memories, well, no, that's not divine. You have to think of the spiritual things, the higher things, right? And I think that's where, the theopoetics challenges sort of like this modernist framework of thinking, especially within spirituality. That the divine is everywhere, in the bite of an apple and the hugging of a tree. People don't want to hear that because they call that New Age spirituality. They call that, that's actually wimpy, right? That's not real theology. That's not how it works. You got to die for your faith. I'm not talking about that. I mean, I think maybe there's a space for that. Yeah, I mean, we have martyrs in our faith. But there's also room for that for what we're talking about here. It's sort of the theological space, or the space so that we see the divine in a certain way, and in metaphor and these descriptions and symbols that introduce something you haven't thought of. The novelty of God. It's interesting. But that's a challenge to modernity. And maybe what meta-modernism hints at, that, how do we re-enchant the scientific? How do you re-enchant logic? How do you re-enchant some of these rules or these principles that are, mainstays? That's the question that meta-modernism approaches, or, brings to the table on that.
Yeah, definitely. And it also brings up even Plato's usage of the word metaxy. I think I'm saying it right, metaxy, and referring to this in-betweenness, right? And you brought up beautifully this tension, right? And so we think of this tension as more of a creative tension of being human, basically, right? It's constantly there. And modernity, in my opinion, failed to see the human experience that way. That it's constantly in between, where the human experience is about in betweenness. It's not about taking actual sides and being biased, because the human experience is constantly in that creative tension, or that tension space, where we are in the middle of everything. We're trying to experience it all, right? We're not trying to sit here and select what is and what is not. We're accepting everything. So like even a theopoet like myself, and when we express these poems, these theopoems, it's not to say that this is absolutely it. Like God is in the smell and nowhere else. It's to say God is possibly temporarily in the smell, but God is also in so many other things simultaneously. Like God cannot be contained or put into like a jar or something. And we do feel like theopoetically modernist thinkers tend to do that. They try to jar things, you know? And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. When we jar things, we're trying to preserve it, extend its life shelf. You know, we don't want it to go bad. We want to keep it almost forever, right? And jarring seems to be a technique that even our ancestors developed a while ago, that worked long before refrigerators. So when you think about this concept of jarring things, it's like, man, they really are triggered by something traumatic. And because of that, they feel like they have to think like this. They have to do these things. So we don't want any of our listeners to think that we are developing some sort of hatred towards modernists, but we're just critiquing and saying, you know, modernists thought about some good stuff, but there's a constant process. And meta-modernism really reminds us that there's an ongoing process. And we should consider these things and not think that once we've jarred it, that's it, you know? And so it really puts us in a state like, if we're not jarring things, then what are we doing with it? How do we experience it? How do we preserve it? you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece on the jarring. We can play with that a little bit. you you know, um, I think it's Toni Morrison that talks about rememory. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And I want to bring that in because this jarring reminds me of this rememory. Um, I feel that jarring is not a bad thing, like you said, right? Let's be honest. If you pickling, I love pickles. John's jelly keeps going. I can't I have to watch my sugar, so I can't do jelly too much. But still, there's so many benefits to jarring things and preserving. As a matter of fact, that's a practice, like you said, that has so much value for extending food, and is used all throughout our Western civilization for our survival. Grateful for it. We're talking about also the jarring of certain categories of ideas and frameworks of thinking. Once again, those are helpful for us, right? How do you so thinking of hymnals as jars? How do I teach theological values? The notion of hymns, the beauty of hymns to bring forth these theological values, right? But it's interesting, and I says we want to kind of hold to that a little bit, and say there are specific things that shouldn't be jarred. You don't want to jar everything. Sometimes things just don't work. Ideas about women. And should women be subordinated? Are women only meant to be helpers? Questions like that, which when the Age of Enlightenment and modernity, these were the critical discussions on women. And the jarring piece and keeping those jarred as we're holding on to these values, which is rearing their ugly head right now in our day and age when we talk about the discussion of abortion, has led to a series of trauma amongst, in this particular discussion, women, but can also be seen in race. The problem of rememory of the trauma of these jarred ideas, and no room for openness and discussion, because modernity also is a call for control on universal principles and making sure they get amplified as much as possible. And you get those problems as well. I mean, I think that reiterates that double consciousness that we speak about. Trauma is due to double consciousness. I must be what the colonizer is, but who I am is probably caged, but it's still who I am. And you get sort of like the schizophrenic person in that sense. So that's you had me thinking on that aspect, and what effects it has on your spirituality, and how that's brought out is quite interesting. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, play on that.
Yeah. You brought up a great fulcrum word, rememory. Love that. By Toni Morrison. Definitely. Rememory is important because a lot of people think that once we step into like spiritual awakening and we're doing our rituals and maybe we join a new community, is feeling good and positive. This is where in America, primarily, neo spirituality tends to get its claws into what's happening. And neo spirituality tends to take people on this kind of spiritual journey that's always on the high. Like they don't come down at all, you know? And if life is all about ups and downs and you're doing something that's constantly got you up, what does that sound like, right? Um Sounds like someone that's like maybe addicted to something or is high off some sort of drug that keeps them elevated, you know, and that's not natural. So, you know, when we're talking about neo spirituality, even neo shamanism, you know, for myself, this is something that we have to confront on a daily basis because there's so many things out there that can become triggers. And this is where rememory comes in because there's things out there that can remind us of our traumas, remind us of things we haven't worked on, or, you know, just parts of our shadow that hasn't been revealed. And so it's an ongoing process. Like people really think naively, of course, you know, that you sit on a pillow and you do some yoga and you light some incense and you wear some beads. It, you know, a lot of this superficial, you know, appearance stuff gets your spirituality elevated, you know, but the real work is inside, beyond the clothing, beyond the beads, beyond the rituals, you know. The rituals are great. They're necessary because they're reflections of what's happening inside. They help us discipline that, you know, and accept those things because acceptance is healing, right? And so when we're sitting there afraid of these things because outward uh, ideas, religions, groups, symbols, and meanings are telling us that those aspects of yourself that you're unaware of, they're demonic, they're terrible, stay away from it. And so, you know, you find yourself then caught up in this whole idea of, well, I want to be new. I want to be reborn. I want to be better, right? And so rememory is found in all these aspects: neo shamanism, neo spirituality, or indigenous spirituality. You know, it's there, you know, and it's just to remind us that there's work to be done. In my honest opinion, you know, rememory for me, as someone who deals with and is constantly trying to heal aspects of myself, we're always finding new things that are triggering, you know, that we never thought of, you know, and it's like, why is that triggering me? You know, if there's like a new law that comes out in the country or something, and it's against maybe something that I'm doing in my life, it oppresses me more. Like it affects me. It affects a lot of people, you know, like, and this is part of the rememory. Like we're memorizing and rememorizing that these are processes that are repeating, cycles repeating. Like when emperor and empire are doing these things back in the 15th, 16th, 18th century, and here we are in the early millennia, they're doing the same stuff. That's part of rememory too. When we feel uncomfortable, like this is crazy. This is not justice. This is a lie. When we feel like that amongst the people, that's rememory. Something inside of us is saying, this has happened before. Don't you remember?
Correct. I agree. That's powerful. That's a powerful part. I think you're right. How this rememory, we just have it within us, and it resonates in our histories, and we recall it, and we get that same bodily trauma, you know, because it's like, not again, not again. We thought we were done. Thought we were done with this. Didn't we do this 100, 200, you know, 1,000 years ago, millennia, 2 millennia ago? Come on. And yet we're forced to repeat a lot of these same principles, you know, and that's the challenge. I mean, that's the challenge that we get with remembering. That's the challenge. I mean, we're forced to go into this I'm afraid to say, I mean, we're forced to fall into a double consciousness, because now you're forced to say, okay, I need to work with the new laws and the new ways that are in place, but I know I'm this, and what do I do about it? And now I'm also thinking that maybe double consciousness is a way of surviving and a way of retaliating, against the colonizing law, right? The reason why other groups would syncretize their gods with the colonizers' gods, so that we still have a memory of it, and how they don't use Mary but El Virgen de Guadalupe. Why do they use her instead, right? And the power and emphasis as a way of pushing back against the colonizer and maintaining their own spirituality that's in place there. That's a fascinating piece that arises from there. Yeah, very much so.
You remind me too, or we remember how even in the Bible, the prophet Isaiah, during that time, let's say that historical time when Isaiah was writing these famous poetic pieces of messaging for the people, to remind the people of Israel, liberation, it has not been forgotten. God has not forgotten us. But how do you uplift your people when you are currently in captivity, and the empire that has you in captivity is trying to make sure that you do not go against, or you don't uprise, or you don't remember who you are. Instead, you take on this double consciousness and take on this new identity. I think the Assyrians were their captives, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Assyrians historically at the time had the people of Israel in captive, and Isaiah was on the streets, spitting these decoding messages that only the initiated, the people of Israel, would understand. And he did it in like these song-like things. So when the guards were passing by, they wouldn't think, y'all talking about uprising? Y'all talking about liberation? Y'all talking about running away and going back home? So it just sounded like gibberish to them. So right in front of their eyes, they were, in their own way, double consciousness, but through language and, even poetics, So we found that very interesting.
I think earlier, prior to our meeting on the podcast, you mentioned about the revolution would be a digital revolution. And as you're talking about this, these, speaking in symbols, speaking in this cryptic way, and how the digital revolution is where everything is happening, whether it was in our voting systems or whether it was in the mass propaganda that was happening in the digital space. That's where the revolution is. And it's going to be interesting how we shift and change in the digital spaces to counter colonizing effects, and as well as move into the new framework of spirituality within the digital space, which I still think is this battle, right? I'm always back and forth on spirituality because of the need to be in community with colleagues, with you. We got to meet up. We meet up every once in a while, but then how we're also able to meet and gather in this way, and counter some of the extremisms and issues that are happening in our day. This is a type of digital revolution, and we increase our spiritual spaces as well. Starting to see them, just that's what's flowing for me at this. I kind of want to recap and jump back in just to say, we've been talking about modernity and some of the effects on frameworks of thinking, on its openness, because of the categories that it has, let's say like logic and reason and science, so that you have multiple groups able to benefit from it, for good or for ill, but how it also opens up problems of pluralism and tolerance. Not that pluralism is the issue, because I don't think pluralism is the issue at all. There is pure difference, and I think that's beautiful. But it's the question of toleration and the background of who ultimately is right. Right? If I were to stick with in the religious space, like, who got it right? Who has the right way of thinking about God? Who has the right way of thinking about the principles? And then sort of like this toleration exists, but, maybe later on we're going to have some beef and we're going to have to deal with it then. And so the framework of modernity still doesn't answer that dilemma and that question. And modernity has brought a lot of good things in the form of that digital revolution and these digital tools. And I think this is an important point, but it also has brought in this increase of materialism and consumerism, which therefore is a form of alienation in various aspects. It alienates us from spirituality and community of others. It says that material progress is the better thing, as opposed to maybe spiritual progress, and led to actually secularization. And I think meta-modernism is trying really hard to say, oh no, we need a spirituality. We need to re-enchant. There is purpose to things, and there is value in community, and there is value to things more than just material goals, material progress, because you can stay really empty there. And I think meta-modernism does want to reiterate this need for community, and that need for community engages the scientific world, and saying we use science not for building missiles or the latest technology, but we build it to bring people together, to save our world, to find better processes, to handle the natural resources in our world and make it available to everyone. Things of that nature. But that's a difficult fight right now.
Yeah, because modernist thinkers would even come in to say, well, yeah, we want to bring people together. We agree. But then you see that how they want to bring people together becomes like 1984 or utopian, and it's like, that's extreme. Like, you just took it and just went the most extreme on the scaling,
Yeah.
And if we're in this meta-modern space of thinking, we're trying to really oscillate between things, because we understand that everything's about relationship. So if we're trying to have relationships with everything to better understand it for ourselves and for others, what does coming together actually look like without the 1984 effect and the whole utopian aspect where there's this concept of perfection, but we're in a meta-modern space, even theopoetics, perfection cannot be obtained. If anything, we can just like oscillate around ideas of perfection, constantly, touching on it, but never really grasping actual perfection, because it's not a destination or it's not a tangible thing. It's just an idea to push us to advance and do things from our opinions or perspectives as better. And even that concept of better needs to be challenged, because even with modernity saying, well, our one way is better. And then we say, dang, that's messed up. What about our way? And then they're like, nah, yours is not better because it didn't think about this. It didn't say it like this. And then, so we really got to be careful about pushing back. It's not black and white. It's not that easy. It's not just like, yeah, let's just change our ways of thinking and we'll be good. It's very complicated because we have so many aspects that are not changing. And if we are the components of the world that are changing, and the world itself is not changing, then we're running into this tension. And this tension is, we think, is where this kind of podcast exists, where it's not saying we're comfortable and it's not saying we're done, but there needs to be some ongoing reflection, thinking, acceptance, changing, within ourselves first, then outward, you know. But modernity, God, please, sorry.
No. Please continue.
No, I was just going to say how modernity definitely, on a spiritual front, does not challenge us, does not push us to become more of what we are, right? If we could just invite, the process thinker, Alfred Whitehead, becoming is such a powerful notion. It's a powerful experience or process that every human being and every living thing is going through. And to sit there and say, you've already become what you would ever become, that's it, you're done. Like, how silly of a notion, when everything else is still in process, has yet to become what it truly is. It's just a fascinating notion to me. Yeah.
When we're talking about colonizers and the colonized, to be in an act of becoming is counter. It's revolutionary. I was gonna say counter-revolutionary. No, it's revolutionary because it does say to the colonizer, you still don't know me. And I'm not sort of like that puppet. I think the colonizer wants to subdue and make you conform to a certain set of values and framework of thinking and framework of being, right? And to make the claim that I'm becoming, for the colonizer, it's like, no, that's not good. I need a certain amount of production. I need a certain amount of produce. Let's look at AI for a second. We like AI because there's a certain level of predictability. They don't want to get to the level of unpredictability. They rather have, okay, I know that I can use AI for these tools. I don't want to think beyond that. I know I want to make sure I have AI be able to think about the other so that I know how they're thinking and can work things out. That's what they want. They want predictability. We want predictability. But to say that one is becoming adds a level of unpredictability and becomes dangerous. When a colonized says, I'm becoming, be afraid, because the colonized is like, okay, wait a minute, what is he talking about? What does he mean? I didn't say he was or she was. What does that mean? What do they have with this thing? And things get nervous. And then the values of reinforcing older values, right? The notion that transgender is a becoming. Thinking about these third genders or multiple genders is like, wait a minute, we don't even know the ramifications of that, and it's not predictable. And if it's not predictable, that's a problem, right? Maybe that's another thing about modernity, is that modernity is predictable. And it leads to the question of a divine. Is the divine predictable? So, if we're becoming, and that leads to a level of unpredictability, right? We can't predict it. We can do our best to make approximations, but at best, I think the same thing applies with the divine. People are afraid of that too. But this is the pushback of going against modernity, maybe what meta-modernism is bringing in, and even what postmodernism bring in, because we haven't talked about postmodernity. We have to talk about that in our next time. But at least when we think about the question of modernity and its spirituality, it did develop a strong frameworks for churches and congregations, but it led to these problems that although there's many, what is that correct framework of thinking? And did not move into the question of, well, can all these aspects have some level of truth to it? They don't want to do that because then it's no longer predictable, right? Everything becomes relative. That's not predictable. And God has to be predictable. We need to make sure that there's right laws. That's the challenge that came out, that modernity really struggled with. And that's why we have, for today, these groups, Christian nationalism, and these other fundamentalist groups are saying, no, there is only this way. And I think the challenge that happens in postmodernism and what they say, and what meta-modernism is offering, is interesting. It's interesting, and I think...
Definitely. That's another great fulcrum word, predictability. Thank you so much. That's powerful. Powerful.
Yeah. Predictable.
When we think about being predictable, it's interesting because just how my mind works. We go back to how the United States, America, even started, right, off of visitors, from Europe coming over, and they came over with predictable notions and beliefs, right? And they told the indigenous people, whatever you believe is wrong because it's unpredictable. I can't predict it.
Yeah.
But I'm going to give you what I can predict. And that's this, the Bible and the cross and these symbols and money and the idea of tax, all this stuff. You got to purchase land, which was a whole nother concept. Like, what? You purchase part of Mother Earth? That's weird. Yeah. But they have that because it's part of, like you're saying, predictability. Like I can carve out land and then make rules and boundaries and add concepts of taxation and ownership and all these things, and it's all predictable because every year there's balancing scales of mathematics that take place to tell you how much you owe, which has been predicted, and it's just interesting. We can keep going with this concept of predictability, and how chattel slavery had to be endorsed by a religious framework so that they can have predictable income. Like we can keep going with this, but it's so crazy. That's such a powerful idea and term you brought up, this idea of predictability. And even in the context of spirituality, is spirituality supposed to be predictable? How do we navigate the unpredictable? How do we accept the unpredictable? I think that's where we're leading to, right?
Yeah. And if we were to give a quick response, there is these exoteric forms of religion, which we find in Protestantism and Catholicism and in other religions, in Islam and Judaism. But then you have the esoteric side, which is completely unpredictable. Instead of following the laws, in the laws we find symbols. In the laws we find these numbers and numerology. When we enter into these mystical states, all we get are guides, no answers. And so even within religion, there's these these resistance to say, you better think, if you think predictability is it, you're off. And we find that within the mystical. We find that within, theosophical spaces. I just think that the when we start thinking about that in mass, that's when it becomes problematic. You don't want everyone in mass getting into these states, because then we're, it's, I'm sorry, there is the utter loss of predictability. Is chaos. And I'm not saying all predictability is wrong. It's once it moves out of the way of harmony, that we see problems. And I'm not saying tolerance, I'm saying harmony. There's a difference in those words that we can probably move into later when we start talking about postmodern and metamodern spaces and spirituality.
Yeah, definitely. This has been an amazing conversation. We hope that you have had a great time listening in on this conversation. We look forward to continuing this dialogue in the next episode. Please look into the description, all the books and concepts we brought up. Our links there to follow along, to see what we're talking about, as well as a link to the previous episode so you can get caught up and look out for the next episode. Did you have anything you wanted to say to close out?
Thank you for watching.
Yes, thank you. And please consider subscribing, liking, and share the content. There's a lot of people out there that may need to listen or get some tidbits from the dialogue. If you are also interested in commenting, please do. We read the comments. We would love to hear from you. If you want to join the dialogue in the future, shoot us an email. Again, everything is in the description. Until then, see you guys next time.